So if you'd all join me in welcoming Dr. Prince-Ramus.
So Mark just gave the introduction to my lecture. Mark, thank you. This is about to become a reverse love fest because the first thing I was going to talk about is front. Turn the lights on. Basically, I can't really follow on that. Pretty much everything we have done in collaboration with Front. And I think as you see what I present and the way we presented some of the details that we present, you'll see how integrated our two practices have become, even though he cheats on me with many other architects. In fact, I'm going to show, I think, 8 or 9 projects, and of all of them, only one of them is not a collaboration directly with Front, and that's simply because we didn't address the facades, and it was a competition. And with that, so I'll go ahead and begin. The topic, I was asked to put the lecture into a question, and so I asked the question, can architecture actually do things? And that is sort of our motto in the office, that we believe that architecture should do, it should not simply represent. Now let me be very clear, I think Mark actually distilled it quite well. We really believe in beauty, okay? We're still obsessed with it. But we also say we're not dumb enough to talk about it in public. Why? You can ask me that question after the lecture. And so instead of seeing form and function as this, traditional things that are at odds with each other, we simply talk about a building's performance, and we try to calibrate anything at our disposal, many of those things being formal or functional, to maximize that building's performance, and we call that its agency. Now, if I were to describe how, if you want a building to be an agent, that you are successful to do it, I would say do not follow the standard modus operandi of our profession, which is, in my opinion, this, which is to take your a priori ambitions and roll them up to the gates of Troy, effectively rolling up a 60-foot Spartan with a spear, and wonder why, by the way, I swear a lot, because it's just about to come out of my mouth. I apologize in advance. Why the hell won't they let me in? Well, it's because you're rolling a 60-foot Spartan with a spear up to the gates of Troy. No wonder they won't let you in. So what you must do, now this idea works if you are malevolent towards your client, benevolent towards your client. It also works if you are malevolent towards your client, and I'll talk about that in just one second. But effectively what you should do, now I personally believe that we are benevolent with our client. We like to identify what the agency is with them. So we work with our client to figure out what the hell will get to the gates of Troy, i.e., what is the thing that will let us in? And once we get the thing in, that allows us to deliver what it is we want the thing to do. Now, you can be benevolent and deliver maidens, or you can be malevolent and deliver whatever your own agenda is. That's not really my issue. That is also between you and your therapist. Now, if I could summarize it into one single diagram, it would be this. And that is to say, if, in my opinion, we as a profession are very good at what we do, we should work with our client to figure out what we want the thing to do, its agency. We should understand the project's constraints, and they can be anything. They can be political, social, economic, schedule related. It really doesn't matter. It can be about what are the things at the forefront of technology, what are the things that are challenging the typology, the profession. I really don't care. Whatever those constraints are, and to understand that they are also malleable to a degree. And then you look, using critical naivete, which I think is the core of this, for the one iteration, or at least the one iteration you think is the most beautiful, that will pass seamlessly through the constraints, not smack up against them and the thing that comes out is some bastardized version of it. Now the process that we go through to do that is banal. Okay, it's dumb. For us, the word dumb is not a pejorative term. If something is dumb, we feel like we're onto something. Our process is dumb. We literally go through the same process in every project. We define what we think the core issues are. In competition, we act as a proxy client. When we have a client, we sit there and we force them to discuss what is troubling them. Right? We act sort of like an architectural therapist. Now the next step is the most crucial step, and that is we take joint positions with them. The reason it's so important to take joint positions, remember, this is all prior to doing architecture. let's go back. The reason we take joint positions with them in the abstraction of architecture is that when we come up to a moment of crisis, when we put something onto the table and the client says, wait, I don't like it. And you say, well, wait a minute, that does what we agreed it should do. That is a moment in which you as an architect are empowered to say, hey, A, we get to go all the way back to the beginning, you have to pay me for additional services because I've done what you asked me to do. But it also reveals a moment that, in fact, maybe what we have learned is that the client doesn't actually want what they originally thought they wanted, and they've learned that along the way. Now, conversely, it also holds you accountable, because when you put stuff on the table, and the client says, that doesn't do what we agreed to do, you will redesign at your own cost, right? So it empowers both parties. And this idea of doing it coming up with the agreements prior to design, means that you don't suffer that trail of tears in which a year into schematic design and design development, suddenly the client says, wait a minute, I don't like this, and then everything falls apart. At the core of this, I already used the term, is critical naivete. And what I mean by critical naivete is to resist to eschew conventional solutions. Now that does not mean do not be conventional. What it means is just hold it at bay. Hold it at bay long enough to find out if the conventional solution is the right one. Sometimes you find out that the conventional solution has to be brought back to life because if for some reason it has actually died. And sometimes you just realize that convention is totally screwing things up. The situation has changed, and for some reason the world, the profession, or your clients are still following some convention that makes absolutely no sense. But that critical naivete is incredibly important. And in our experience, if we get followed through this process of identify the core issues, take positions on them, and only then put forward architectural manifestations using critical naivete. At every, I guess I hadn't put that up yet. In our experience, you will find a solution that is so specific to the problem, so specific to the site, so tailored to that exact combination of situations that it will both be highly performative and so unique that it will actually give remarkable aesthetic experiences. Now, often I've had people say, has it ever not worked? And all I can say is, to date, it's always worked. I can't promise it will always work, but to date, it seems like it has always worked. Now, I'm going to go through, I think, 8 or maybe 9 projects. I'm going to try and do them quickly. I might speak for a long time. If you need to leave. I won't be offended. You can also ask questions while I'm talking. I won't be bothered by that either. The first series of projects are built projects, and I'm intentionally doing that to justify the process I'm putting forward. So that then I'll show you a series of projects we're currently working on, and you'll notice that I will not be able to make quite the same argument yet. The reason for that is we have not finished the project, and full confession, the way I present, it has a lot of kind of retroactive logic, right? We are in a process where we believe argumentation is incredibly important. And so therefore, the real process looks like this. We hope to God it always moves forward. Sometimes it moves backwards, but eventually it moves forward again. But I will give you something that looks perfect. I understand that. We can talk about that afterwards, what that actually means. So the first project I'm going to start with, I have to start with the Seattle Central Library. And I have to start with it because it's the genesis of this process, and it's the genesis of the process having largely to do with my own experiences. When I started as a partner in charge of this project, I was only 29. And I was running an office in New York, and my mentor and partner, senior partner, was mostly in Rotterdam, if not flying around the world, and he was not necessarily always present. And therefore, I could not walk into a room as a 29-year-old with an incredibly astute board and say, hey, this is my vision. They would simply laugh at me and say, kid, get the hell out of here. And so the only way we realized as an office, kind of sitting alone in New York, that we could get these people to do what we wanted was through argumentation. Okay? And that's why originally I said, we don't talk about beauty in public. Because if I had said to them, it's my vision, or I think it's beautiful, and they had said, I don't, we would have been screwed. And so we developed this process. So with that, I'm going to start the argumentation of the Seattle Library. And in each of these projects I'm going to go, what are the core issues? What were the positions? And then what was the architectural manifestation? So with the Seattle Library, there were actually 2 really big issues. And then we took 2 big positions, but there are a lot of other nuanced ones. But the two big ones I want to focus on, the first had to do with the moment in time, 1999. 1999 was still at the, prior to the explosion of the bubble, the tech bubble. So there was incredible optimism about technology. A lot of the prophecies have actually come true about things that make technology ubiquitous, being in your hand or in your glasses and so forth. Seattle at that moment was incredibly wealthy, and there was a huge mandate for this building. At the same time, Microsoft Real Networks and other groups were spending billions of dollars trying to make the book disappear. And because of that, we and the client were justifiably scared. And that's why the issue of taking positions became so important. We knew that we had to be able to stand in front of the public and say, this is why we're spending $111.9 million of your tax money this way. We may be wrong, but you can see that at least it's been well reasoned. We're not doing this frivolously. So the first issue was, at that time, we were seeing a simultaneous explosion of responsibilities and of information. What was interesting about that moment, and you probably sort of take that for granted now, believe it or not, in 1999, that wasn't really apparent. And libraries were not really readily saying, yeah, both of those things are their mission. They're actually saying, you know what, information explosion, that's our mandate. Social responsibility, yeah, it comes along for the ride, not really what we're supposed to be doing. Now that's interesting, because at the same time, what we were seeing when we visited contemporary libraries is that the owners and architects were relying on what I'll call universal flexibility, one space that you could do anything in. Now, if you actually have two responsibilities, and they're both expanding, and they're both hungry, but you only really recognize one, that one will eat the other one alive. And that's what we were seeing. We were seeing buildings whose information explosion was the squeaky wheel, and whose social responsibility was getting squished out of the building. And so our position, our architectural position, which really was the foundation of the entire formation of the building, was what we called compartmentalized flexibility. Take the things whose evolutions we could predict, at least the spectrum of which we could predict, and put them inside boxes, and only solve that one thing in that box with its own form of tailored flexibility, its own mechanical systems, its own detailing, its own structure, its own circulation. And on the rooftops, place those things whose evolutions we couldn't really predict, but still wanted to have specific architectural character. And that was the core of the idea. We presented that to the library, and they said, you know what? We don't buy that as a position. We don't buy that as a position because, just like everybody else at that time, they say, information explosion is our responsibility, the other social responsibility explosion is not our responsibility. What was interesting at that moment is that we had actually been given their program already. And this was a program, by the way, that's the width of the site, so you get a sense of how many floors you would have to stack up. It was a square, essentially. That is the program as they gave it to us after developing it for about 10 years. And the first thing that we did is we presented back to them, and I think this is the job of architects. It's not our job to tell people how to do what they do, but it is our job to act as a kind of therapist, to say, almost like a mirror, you're saying one thing, but you're doing another thing. This diagram became incredibly important. We simply showed them that after 10 years, their own program was already only 1/3 information explosion and 2/3 social responsibility. And so we're not asking them to change. We're not saying, we know your business better than you. We're saying, you've changed and you just don't recognize it. And you're still building buildings like you used to be. And you now need to build buildings in a new way. And they said, go away. We went away. And about 3 weeks later, they said, come back. We came back. And they said, you know what? You're right. So actually, we agree with the position. So we'll take it. So what does that mean in terms of the design of the building? Well, they gave us the right to combine everything back into its cardinal elements, and then subdivide the building just based on the previous diagram of sort of compartments. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 compartments, into which were the things whose evolutions we could predict, and 1, 2, 3, 4 elements whose evolutions we couldn't really predict. And that was literally a section of the building. And so we were taking all kinds of very specific decisions without any architecture yet, about, hey, the children should be off 4th Avenue, the living room should be off 5th Avenue, the staff should be divided in between. the main loci where the staff, the librarians would be between the meeting areas and the books. Why? Because actually we started to be off-site learning and they wanted adjacency and so forth. So literally that was a design of a building. And again, we went away. And 3 weeks later, we came back with the design. And the design was literally that diagram, right? So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 boxes, and then 1 down here, 2, 3, 4 in between spaces. We presented it to them. It was a very robust concept, but yet we didn't really know what the architecture would be inside of any of those boxes. And then something which Mark touched on, which I won't go into, we skinned it. We skinned it with a hybrid of a lateral system combining the facade system, and that was the result. Now, when we first pulled the thing out of the box, the library board again said, go away. We went away. 3 weeks later, they said, come back. We came back. And they said, I don't know what that is. And you could see they were so pained. And he said, but it's everything that we agreed to do. So if you can do it for the budget, do it. And you could see they were so upset. And then when we pulled it out of the box to the public, the same thing, right? The public went, this isn't what we need. We're spending $111.9 million for libraries. We don't need the architect's ego. We need a library. Now, we didn't defend it. The library staff defended it. The library board defended it. The city librarian defended it. The director of the central library defended it. And they said exactly the same thing. I don't know what that is. But it's absolutely every single decision we agreed to take together, and every time they changed it, it didn't do it. And so we told them to build it. And that's a really hard thing for someone who's trying to create a critical op-ed piece to make any kind of story when a 65-year-old librarian says something like that. Conversation was over. All right, so there's the building. Just as a side note, we call this elevation pig. Very important thing. Things are often awkward and ugly, and they tend to have to be awkward and ugly for the thing to actually be beautiful. Every time we attempted to resolve this one elevation, which was the ugly side of the building, the whole thing started to become kind of bland. And so just like the gap between Lauren Hutton's teeth, the fact that this thing had this thing that couldn't be resolved actually was important. And again, we can talk about that later, what that means in terms of our philosophy of beauty. But going through the building, you see this kind of alternating experience of what we call an in-between space, and then a very specific, tailored area, an in-between space, very tailored area, an in-between space, very tailored area, all the way up to the reading room, right? So it's almost like a single building that has 5 different buildings connected by an urban trajectory. Now the second issue has to do with the ubiquitousness of information. At that time already, there were discussions at Microsoft and Real Networks and Amazon about this. Now, if you can access information from anywhere in the world, why would you get in your car, drive to downtown, fight for parking, go and park in the Central Library, walk up through the stairs or go into the elevator, and go find what you're looking for? Why would you just simply look it on your handheld? What's the purpose of a library in an age in which information can be accessed anywhere with Google and Siri? Well, from our position, it was curatorship. We said, look, the building should no longer be about access to information. It should be about access to librarians. Because librarians are a highly underused resource. First of all, most of them have PhDs. Second, they spend most of their time acting as docents, holding you by the hand and trying to help you to find something. That's a really inefficient use of a human being. Now, when you type in Finnegan's Wake on your handheld or on a library server, and you get 1.2 million positive hits, how are you going to know which one is what you want to look at? The librarian. The librarian is going to help you sift through that ever-exploding amount of information. And so we said we need to change the paradigm of the building. First, combine with this idea of compartmentalized flexibility, but combine it with how to combat that situation, which is librarians are sort of spread out through the building in fiefdoms, and we want to figure out a way to do this. We want to put them in a collective so they can dogpile you. So when you want to do research on Descartes, you can actually have someone who knows social philosophy, pure philosophy, and mathematics, all discussing with you to find out what it is you really want to study, whether it really is this avenue, or maybe it's that avenue, or maybe they turn you onto something totally different, and you start doing research on Hegel. But that's their purpose. In order to do that, we had to overcome this, which is the other trail of tears I will talk about tonight, which is the infernal situation when you walk into most libraries in which you type in what you're looking for, you get a Dewey Decimal number, you take that Dewey Decimal number and you relate it to some sort of category like humanities, literature, and fiction. And to be honest, to this day, I do not know what the difference is between humanities, literature, and fiction, right? Dostoevsky, it's fiction, it's clearly literature, it's definitely humanities. Why isn't it in all of them or one of them? I don't understand. So you take it from the Dewey Decimal number, you put it into some classification that means nothing to you, then you look onto a board at the floor it has to go to, you get into an elevator, you push the button, you come out, and now you have to do the same thing in reverse. I said, well, that's why librarians are used as docents. If we could instead create a system that is so clear to navigate by the patron that you don't need librarians for it, now the librarians can be pulled out of the books. And so we created the book spiral. Book spiral, simple idea. If you could do anything in the world, you go 000 to 999, right, running the Dewey Decimal System linearly. And as anything within the Dewey Decimal System explodes or contracts, it just sort of does it organically, and the thing grows. As long as you allow that system to double, and in our particular case, that was the charge, allow the building to go from 750,000 books to 1.5 million books, it will always be in order, simply by reshelving, people checking out books and reshelving. In Seattle, though, that would have taken about 5 linear blocks, and so we wrapped it up into a 5-story spiral. Also known, after the project manager said, oh, you can't do that, that's going to be incredibly expensive, it's also known as a parking garage, and that project manager had just finished one right down the street for a very low budget, and we said, dude, critical naivete. Books, they don't explode. And believe it or not, they don't really burn like cars do. So if you could do it down there for a low cost in a developer building, why can't we do it in this building also for a low cost? Right? That's a core part of this idea of critical naivete. So there's the solution. And in this building, you get your call number and forget about everything else. You get into the elevator. The elevator doesn't have floor numbers. It's got call numbers. You push the call number. You come out on the floor. Call numbers on the floor. And you just walk to the call number, and that's it. And that allowed us to create the mixing chamber, this interdisciplinary zone in which the librarians could dogpile you. Okay, so that took a while, but now I'm going to start accelerating the explanation of each project. This might be interesting for the group I just met with. This is the Wyly Theater in Dallas. Well, this isn't, but this was the building that we were replacing. The, Dallas Theater Center, that's the resident company of the Wyly Theater. The Dallas Theater Center had been performing in this horrible little building since the late 50s. And when they invited us to do the building, or we went through the selection process and won it, what we were surprised at is that they were a remarkably successful, innovative theater company. It made no sense. Why in Dallas? Right? Theater in the United States is in Seattle. I always say that one first. I'm from Seattle. So Seattle, Chicago, and New York. The only outlier that anyone knows is the Guthrie in Minneapolis. Why Dallas? Why do they get some of the best artistic directors and actors and dramaturges and scenic designers to go to Dallas? Well, the first position was actually because of that shitty little building. Why? Because they could do whatever they wanted to it. So if they do a streetcar named Desire, they blew a hole right through the side of the building and just brought a motorcycle in. When they did a cherry orchard, they brought a backhoe and dug a 30-foot hole through the floor in that slab of the building. Now, if you propose to do that on Broadway as an artistic director, you are fired on the spot. So because this building was so malleable, they could do things they couldn't do anywhere else in the world, and that's why they became an important theater company. Well, then we come along. If we, as the architect, were to propose a building that was so pristine that they couldn't blow holes through it, in 10 years, they would have a, quote, beautiful building, if we succeeded, and they'd have no theater company, because we would literally kill the potential of the company. That's a daunting thing to be confronted with as an architect. And so the first position we took was, we better not do that. The position is, we need to build a new building that is just as malleable as that building. And the second issue was that they were what's known as a multi-form theater company. Now, multi-form means they do every show in a different configuration. First one in truss, next one in proscenium, next one in traverse, next one in the round, and so forth. They could do this from the late 50s all the way up into the late 90s because material and labor was relatively cheap. And there'll be a common thread to a lot of what I'm describing tonight, that we have seen an inverse in public institutions. When I was a kid, and there's going to be people in this audience who are not Canadian and who are my age, who remember, like, PBS had always said, sponsored by First Boston. Well, guess what? First Boston isn't interested in sponsoring the annual operating budget of anything anymore. No one is. Right? So we've seen a decline in the ability of institutions to raise money for operational budgets, and an increase in institutions' ability to raise money for capital budgets. So what happened is they started to run out of money, and eventually they had to they had to fix their multi-form theater into a single configuration. And so the second position we took is let's reapportion the money. Let's not ask for more, but let's take the money from capital A architecture and put it into infrastructure such that they don't require operational budgets to go amongst various configurations. So those are the two positions. The manifestation was done. Take the front of house and make it below house, take the back of house and make it above house. Truly done. Makes no sense at first. The reason was it allowed us to create what we like to call affectionately superfly. Really? I got nothing. Okay, well I guess there isn't anybody my age or older in the audience, except for Mark. Superfly, the idea of superfly is that you could take the fly tower, all the flexibilities associated with it, and smear it out over the auditorium. And then all the pristine elements you could pick up, therefore, and into the fly tower or into the extended fly. And that would remain an environment that you could nail, drill, cut, glue, paint, and replace at minimum cost. And then the third result was something that we didn't actually anticipate at first. It wasn't one of the positions, but it became one, was that it simply, therefore, opened up the perimeter of the chamber such that the artistic director could now control suspension of disbelief. He or she could decide when Dallas appeared or disappeared from your audience's collective consciousness. So there you see the building. That's it before it opened in a thrust configuration. So these are the four configurations that we agreed with the client we had to do with 2 stagehands and a push of a button in about 15 minutes. And the agreement was that these configurations had to have exceptional sight lines, exceptional acoustics, and exceptional intimacy. Now this also is something that has become a theme in our work ever since, which is that if you, instead of provide, I already discussed it in the library, right, this idea of divide and conquer, provide very specific things, and really you get a lot of flexibility. Same thing here. What we learned is if you give a bunch of very specific presets along a spectrum, as opposed to a black box where you could theoretically do anything, but you don't have the money to do anything, so you actually do nothing. If you give them these presets, and each one of them can be moved off center, weirdly, if you kind of squint, you start to realize you have an enormous amount of flexibility. And so we wanted to be able to do all of those, but we also started to test how easy it was to push all of these off center to create some of the other configurations. So we also added arena and traverse. Now these weren't things we talked to the client about. We only talked about those. But we did arena, traverse, and then we made up to bipolar and sandwich. That one was mine. Just to see how flexible this thing is. In virtue of giving them presets, does it actually increase the flexibility? There you see it actually again before it was open, but someone was just getting a lecture in the building in thrust. This was Henry IV. This was the very first show. This was something that the theater consultant and we designed together. It was basically to see how crazy we could make the auditorium, and we succeeded, and it was totally infernal, and no one knew where everything was coming from. And then there was the flat floor configuration. This one was an interesting debate between us and the client. It cost an extra $500,000. Not an extra as in we asked them to increase the budget, but an extra from the architectural side to do. And what was strange is that we, the architects, were arguing to do this. And they really resisted us. Why do you need to do flat floor? It's not a theater configuration we think is going to use very often. Ironically, they do now use it a lot. But that wasn't why we were arguing for it. We were arguing for it because while they were building this building, they were also building right across the street the Winspear Opera House. The Winspear Opera House is 2,300 seats. And the Dallas Theater Center survives, historically, by getting road shows from Broadway. Well, where do you think those road shows are going to go once they build a 2,300-seat opera house right next door during the summer? They're all going to go to the opera house. And so weirdly, this institution, the AT&T Performing Arts Center, was building one institution that was cannibalizing the revenue source of the other. And it was the one that was already revenue stream. So why a flat floor? Because if you can go to a flat floor in 15 minutes with 2 stagehands, with a fly tower that extends over the entire place, you now have the single most inviting rental space in all of Dallas. And they can rent the space out for $50,000 a night, and they currently make more money by renting the space than they used to make in the old building on ticket sales for their entire year. Now that means they now have a lot of revenue to do really interesting stuff. Right? And that, I think, is a great example of the architecture doing something. This is it going through its first transformation. I said 2 people in 15 minutes. You will see about 40 people in about 6 hours. We were just trying to find stuff. But I'll go back to what I said previously, was that the unique moment in this project was when we, the architects, started to argue for reapportioning the budgets for infrastructure. And I think it was only because it was coming from us that, in fact, Mark will attest, there was a moment in which we did a Hail Mary and the client didn't know it. We said, we can still do capital A architecture with that budget. And what we did is we held basically cheap aluminum siding in the budget for the exterior, knowing damn well we had no idea how to do something extraordinary with that budget. But we had confidence that we would be able to do so. I think it probably wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for Mark. Okay, I'm going to go on. So then the other repercussions, they said, wasn't something originally planned for, but maybe became the most important and defining thing about the building. This notion that the entire perimeter can open up. So there you see the enclosure. That enclosure is an STC 57 glass wall. Basically, it's like a box-in-a-box construction. What you're seeing inboard is not a theater curtain. It is actually a trompe-l'oeil. It is actually vinyl curtains that are integrated just on the inboard of that acoustic wall. And that enclosure can therefore be totally blackened out. You can do totally hermetic normal theater, but you can also open the entire perimeter up. Right? So now at the last act of Macbeth, as the artistic director, if he or she wants you to associate the parable that you're seeing on the stage, he or she can do so. Right? I'm sorry to say to be or not to be. Anyway, right at that moment, and suddenly you see daylight, or you see darkness, you see cars driving by. Interestingly enough, you don't hear cars driving by. So it allows you to still have the hermetic environment, but to allow reality in, i.e. it's no longer the hand of the architect that determines the suspension of disbelief. What's interesting about this idea is that it also started to build patronage. People would come, Dallas is not a great climate, so it's not very often, or at least I should, the hit months where it happens is not very great. But families will come and sit on the grass outside, and they'll watch them block out sets, and they'll watch them rehearse, building up their patronage. Now, their patronage has increased threefold. Another statistic is that when I was talking about the flexibility, actually maybe I'll come back, no, I'll say it now anyway. We're talking about the flexibility. Of the 25 shows that they have, productions that they have run in the building since 2009, they have done it in 20 different configurations. There are 4 presets. That means they've done 16 shows in something that doesn't look like anything like the preset we gave them. And the other fact, or factoid, I guess, that kind of proves the concept, is that over the first 50 years of their existence, they sent 12 different productions out of house to other institutions, but all of them were small regional theaters. In the last 5 years, they have sent 7 to Broadway or off-Broadway. To take this idea of the perimeter opening a step further, we then also made the perimeter open. So when they do a streetcar named Desire, they can literally now drive a motorcycle directly in, and they can have the audience come directly out of the building. So in the end, this is what we gave them, a kind of palette, right? They have multi-form, but they also have multi-procession. Effectively, you can call it episodic with processional, focal, and open, but effectively it is Renaissance, Wagnerian, Greek, and contemporary. So the ideal is Okay, they can use our auditorium, and in our auditorium you go down into the building, you go into a lobby, it's got little dangly lights. You might like dangly lights, you might not like dangly lights. You go up our stair, up into your seat. But the artistic director can literally say, I want someone to come in a Wagnerian sequence directly into the chamber. So now they could do this. You could enter Wagnerian, first act in thrust, intermission in Greek, second act in arena, and everyone leaves through our lobby with dangly bits. That, I would call, is architecture doing something, right? Our hand as architects empowering the user. Without, I hope, creating something that you would claim is sort of shitty architecture. Now, how we get to this, I will say our process is Darwinian. Okay, it's this kind of incredibly logical process. But at every moment we will have in this decision tree moments in which 2 or 3 or 4 different ideas all work. And this happens 4 times a day. And at every one of those moments, there's a subjective aesthetic decision being made. And so it is not form following function. It is a totally blended process. But it is still highly Darwinian, highly argument-based. And there you see the conclusion. Okay, now the next project I'm going to show, first I have to, it's actually 2 projects. I have to start with a sad story and end with a happy story. The issue and position and manifestation of this entire thing is just about speed. Now it starts with a project that we started in 2006 for a interdisciplinary building for Caltech. Now Caltech is this square like this. Now Caltech is beautiful. It takes 15 minutes to walk from there to there. It is always 72 degrees. They are the richest institution in the United States by a magnitude of 10. Right? The next closest institution gets 1/10 the funding per student, federal funding per student, and that's Stanford that Caltech does. So they're rich, they're warm, they're in beauty, there are no problems. We didn't know what to do. There was no hook. And in fact, the only thing we came up with originally, honest to God, was our first thing was, it's a center, but it's not in the center of the campus. And that was it. It was kind of all we could dig up. Eventually, we created this. Right? It was an interdisciplinary building where they're going to take people who had won the Nobel Prize in applied and computational mathematics, in chemistry, in particle physics, and so forth, and just dump them all into one building and just say, have at it. Let's see what happens. So we created, the concept was a big flat plate on which all of these Nobel Prize winners would be sitting with their entourages of postdocs and doctoral students and graduate students and undergraduates, and they would grab or give up space on that plate based on a set of rules. And so we designed that plate in order to facilitate that, and then we took all the recitation areas and all the debate areas and made this tower in the center. And we wrapped it in a kind of cocoon, so it looked like a big caterpillar thingy. You can see the kind of the weirdness of the spaces. Yes, this is one that Mark also had his hand in. It was horribly ugly, and we liked that. It sat not in the center of the campus. I will say that it was being built right next to this building, which was the most recent building to be built, and it happened to be Spanish style, and that one also happened to be Spanish style. Didn't really think anything about that at the time. We got all the way through concept design. The university loved it. They approved it. We were supposed to start schematic design and said, wait, it has to be approved by the Pasadena Design Commission. You didn't think that was something we might have needed to know at the beginning of the process? Now this, of course, is an interesting moment in contracts in which you're not really sure who's on the hook for this. Right? You did your job, it was approved, you met the positions you all took, now you're going to go before the design commission. You don't really know what is going to happen, and we should have known what was going to happen based on what we saw here. The design commission kind of looked at it for a second and said, no, it's got to be Spanish style. So I think I'm really smart. I go to the president of Caltech, who is also a Nobel Prize winner, and I say to him, look, this would be kind of cool. I don't know anything about Spanish style. So a lot of people in Pasadena do. Why don't you hire someone to do a Spanish style box, and we'll put it around a really crazy kind of ugly wild thing, and it will do exactly what you wanted, which is to have this really gregarious thing, but it'll be even more gregarious and weird because it's in a Spanish style box. Now, the president of Caltech looked at me and he said, you know, Josh, you've been telling me for about 5 months now that constraints are the mother of opportunity. Isn't this just another constraint? I.e., don't try to outsmart really smart people. You totally called my bluff. So now I'm in a total panic. I'm in total panic because I really don't know what to do. We're going to have to redesign. It's too early in the process to ask them to pay us because that will piss them off and we'll lose the project. So we're starting to redesign at our own cost. And fundamentally from square one, because we're trying to think, how on earth are we going to do Spanish style? And we thought about this and thought about this for about 3 weeks. Everything in our world is in 3 weeks. Thought about this for about 3 weeks. And then we realized we were doing the wrong thing. We were focused on the wrong issue. The issue was not the design. Now, what does Neo say to the kid? He says, how do you bend the spoon? And what does the kid say back?
There is no spoon.
Thank you. You know how many times in universities I've given this image and no one knows the answer? I even did it at Sauerkraut Week, like next to Hollywood. No idea what I was talking about. There is no spoon, right? The problem was not the design. The problem was the design commission. We had to redesign the design commission. So we asked the head of communications of the university to put us on the docket on the first day that the design commission was going to review 85, basically, garage additions. Now, you have to understand that Pasadena is full of mid-century modernist buildings. And all of those beautiful mid-century modernist buildings, for some reason, now need to have Spanish-style garage additions. So we go in with 2 slides. And the first slide was this one. And we said to the Design Commission, over the last 82 years on which you have been legislating what can happen on the campus, you have indeed done Spanish style and Spanish style. You've also done modernist and brutalist and neo-modernist, and you've done bad. And the only thing, if you squint, that you seem to have legislated over 82 years is the color beige. And our building is beige, so you better let us do it. Now, you would think there would have been total silence, but there wasn't. There was a huge shitstorm erupted, not from the design commission, but from the people behind us who were waiting to do their garage additions. They went, yeah, you're right. Why do I have to do a Spanish-style garage? So we then just took our 2 slides and walked up the stage. 3 weeks later, we got, I already gave the punchline away, we got a letter from the Design Commission. The Design Commission basically said, go away. As long as you do a building that is 3 stories, austere with a ground floor arcade, do not come back. Okay? And so we took the old idea and we did what we call the wolf in sheep's clothing building. We just inverted it. Like a sea slug that walks up to something and wants to eat it and just literally inverts itself to eat the thing. Just went like that to the building. We took the thing that used to be really austere and kind of rectilinear and uptight in the center, and we put it around the perimeter. And that's where we put all of the Nobel candidates into little entourages. And we basically built the world's most hyper motel. Okay, it was a post-tension concrete slab building built up on little pilotis. It had no detailing. It was concrete floor, concrete ceiling, so low so that we didn't have to have breaks in the stairs. And the way we did that is we didn't have mechanical systems. We just put fan coil units in the wall, just like a cheap motel. And that cheap motel would blow over in a wind. And so into the center, we had to put a more gregarious structure, a steel structure. And that steel structure had all the recitation areas. So it was the gregarious thing that they wanted to be interdisciplinary and mixing in the center. And its slopes and so forth were all very carefully designed to create bent plates. Why? Go back to your structures class. When you take something and you fold it, what do you end up doing to it? You increase what? Its moment of inertia. Okay, when you increase its moment of inertia, you increase its stiffness. So, if we could come up with a system in which we had 2 diagonals per face, per floor, per face, we would create an idealized braced frame. Now, that's what we presented to them. We're now 6 months in. We've been working for 3 months at our own cost. We present this. By the way, there was still this little thing on the roof that we wanted before. And we presented to them, they said, that's great, we really like it, but couldn't this move over here? And couldn't it move? And we said, no, it'll fall down. I said, come on, that can't be true. They said, no, it'll fall down. So they took the building over to the physics department. The physics department looked at it, and the physics department said, it'll fall down. And so it was a moment in which we truly hand-clapped the client simply because we didn't want to have to keep redesigning at our own cost. We'd had enough. And there you see the building, sort of representation of the interior. They built it just as I would say. First the steel braced frame, and then they would build the post-tension concrete lightweight structure around the exterior. And it is 3 stories austere with a ground floor arcade, and these are by code roof appurtenances. That was great. We were 2 weeks away from starting construction. Morpheus's astrophysics building had just started. There were 3 buildings behind us that were also in the works. And then the president suddenly stepped down with no real explanation, and a very sort of curmudgeonly Frenchman stepped in, who wasn't really into contemporary architecture and was certainly not into continuing the legacy of his predecessor. And we got shit canned on the spot. Just, we got a letter that said, here, that's it. Don't ever call us again. Here's your models. Basta. Goodbye. And this was literally 2 weeks before we were supposed to start construction. We put it away. That was 2008, and that was it. That was it until 2009. 2009, this man, he's about this tall, walked into our office with Giselle Bundchen. And I looked at Giselle Bundchen. And he's talking, and I'm looking at Giselle Bundchen. And he says, my family owns, we're 50% owners of the most important high-end fashion company in Turkey, and it's really the most high-end fashion company in the Middle East. And we have just learned, this is on Friday of Fashion Week, and I guess Giselle was his muse. And on Monday of Fashion Week, he had found out that the government was going to destroy the building that his father had designed. It was designed by, that his father had built and had been designed by a member of Siam, a beautiful sort of modernist structure. They were going to demolish this headquarters and factory with eminent domain to build a freeway off it. And because they were owned 50% publicly, they were worried that, of course, if that happened, their stock prices would crash. And this was at the worst of the market, right? It's 2009. He thought, we may go under, simply because of the negative publicity of losing our headquarters. So what he starts to say, and I'm not really paying attention, is he says, I need someone to design and build a world-class building in 11 months. And I'm still looking at Giselle, but that caught my ear, and I thought, this guy is nuts. He's truly nuts. And he said, no, but don't worry about it, because my cousin, who's the CFO, he just bought a structure that has been sitting fallow in the hills of Istanbul for 25 years. So we'll just use that. It'll be a lot faster and a lot quicker. And I'm thinking, this guy's on hashish. Like, that is not going to be faster or quicker. It's going to be slower and infinitely more expensive. Until he showed me a picture of what his cousin had just bought 2 days earlier. And I said, can I show you a project? So I showed him Caltech. I said, do you like it? He said, yeah. I said, do you like it a lot? I said, yeah. I said, okay, let's go to dinner and you bring Giselle and we'll talk about terms. So that was on Friday. On Sunday, we flew to Istanbul. On Monday, we met with his structural engineer. I will say that these things exist all over the countryside in Istanbul. Why? Because development is cheap there. Labor and materials are still cheap. Land is cheap. And so speculation is cheap. And so people start to build things, and if it doesn't seem like it's pan out, they just walk away from it. So this thing was just sitting on a really prominent spot on the Asian side of the Bosphorus. We got to Istanbul on Monday. We met with his structural engineer. That is the structure as given. And literally, because it was also meant to be a motel, it was exactly the same floor height. It was basically exactly the same perimeter and shape as Caltech. And so all we had to do for that day is figure out how to take that and morph it into that structurally. And on Wednesday, they started construction with construction documents of the perimeter. Okay, now we are 1 day in. Right? He said 11 months. But the problem was inverted. We had this thing. Right? It was, I'm already showing you the refinement of the structure, but effectively it was this really, really, really heavy concrete structure. Heavy concrete structure, because I don't really worry about so much with the structural engineering. They just throw tons of rebar and concrete at it. They have really bad earthquakes, so they just kind of over-design it. They don't really care. So it's this incredibly heavy concrete building into which we had to very quickly design the other stuff, right? Because we couldn't take Caltech's guts. We had to take the guts that would apply here. And that thing had to be a lightweight steel structure because of speed. And because we didn't know how the concrete exterior would perform, we had to keep them disengaged. So it was the exact inverse problem of Caltech. Heavy steel structure holding up a lightweight concrete structure. This project, heavy concrete structure that is not engaging at all a lightweight steel structure. And we took a page out of the Seattle library and took all the program and put it into boxes, but these were very special boxes. These were boxes that structurally could be put onto each other in any possible way and welded together and the thing would stand up. Right, so they're kind of like massive Lego. That took us about 2 weeks. We needed to stay on schedule. We needed to have the steel back after 2 months. We were 1 day in when we started construction. We were 2 weeks in by the time we had finished this and sent this off to the steel mill, sent the mill order off to the steel mill to get the steel back. And now they had 6 weeks to make the steel. And in that time, we were figuring out how to take these boxes, to slope them, to put them in appropriate adjacencies to the rest of the program, slope them so they become the primary circulation as you see here. We're going through all these iterations trying to solve the problem. And after 6 weeks, when the steel showed up, we said, it's that one. Build that one. And they did. And by the way, to our complete shock, at one point we realized one of the boxes wasn't where it was really supposed to be. And we're like, what are you doing? And it turned out that they had taken our model of this thing and they were building it off the model, not off the drawings. Why? Because that thing could go any way it wanted to, and they built it, so that's the thing we designed, they built it as I just described. They rented the property next door, they built the box in its entirety, picked it up in the air, craned it over, and dropped it into the center. So here you see the ring, now it has become a perfect square, and sort of erupting out of the belly of Cain is the alien. It's another great Hollywood reference. You didn't? Okay. And so there you see, this is the 5th box being craned in. That's the 6th box. That's the 7th box. And that's the 8th box. And they did the entire steel erection in 1.5 weeks. So we are now 2 months, 1.5 weeks into the project. Full disclosure, we missed it by 2 months. It ended up being 13 months, not 11 months. But this is the result. This is the basement area. There used to be a parking garage. That's the library. This was a museum dedicated to his father, showing all the various designs that they had done. The auditorium, which was going from the basement up to level 1. We used the rooftop of the auditorium to go from level 1 up to level 2. The next box, which is the kind of, not procurement area, but the buyer's area. They create clothes, but they also create really remarkable textiles. So people will come and order textiles, and this is the buying area for the textiles. They go up to level 2, then they use the meeting box, which has all the meeting rooms, to get up to level 3. Level 3 is the headquarters, and there you see Jem after 13 months. Now, as I said, the entire issue was how do we do this in 11 months, which we failed. And the entire position was do everything in 11 months. That was it. And so one of the interesting things for us is after being obsessed about resolving every option and making sure we're doing the right thing, here we didn't have the time to do that. We had to move quickly. We also realized that gave us a lot of leverage on the client. And so at one point we said to Jem, we want to wrap the entire thing in one-way mirror glass. Right, so these are actually totally unadulterated photographs of what we call the show box. And Jem, of course, was like, and we said, Jem. So Jem built it. Also in a kind of pained way. And we wanted to do it, to be honest, and we never told them this, but since it was a kind of chauvinistic, kind of voyeuristic enterprise of fashion, that we thought, okay, if we're going to do it in spades, and have Giselle Bundchen replicated 1,000 times the building through all the mirrors. So you could say that's what we designed. Then there was the issue of the thing around it, the thing that we were given. Now, we knew we couldn't do anything sexy with it. I hope the right image comes up. No, actually, I know it's going to come up in a second. Jem kept saying, I want to put the name of my company, Vakko, on the building. And I'm like, it's not really us, Jem. Don't really do that. And he really wanted, no, that's not the image I thought it was going to be. And he kept talking about Louis Vuitton, kept talking about Coach. I said, Jem, instead, you have this really, really robust building that you can't make go away, and you want to emphasize sustainability. You're the first company in Turkey that is focused on sustainability. It would be more sustainable or say more beneficial as a sign of sustainability to reveal that you're doing an adaptive reuse building, not to let us try to hide it. Because first of all, we're never going to do it. They're always going to, if we did it, first we're going to look bad, and they're going to think you commissioned a shitty building. So if we could reveal the guts, you can then use it as part of the branding of the building. And to do that, we had to create what we like to call saran wrap. You make the glass so thin that it reveals the contents, reveals the thing that we're building all this around. Now, it goes back to structures again. If you have plate glass, it's going to be quite thick. If you put emollient around it, the glass gets thinner. But if you can slump the ideal shape, structural shape into the glass, i.e. increase its moment of, increase its stiffness, and that can make the glass super thin. And why would it be an X? Because we didn't know how this thing would react in an earthquake. We didn't have time to do a forensic analysis. So the most expeditious way of putting it on the building was 2 pins at the top, classic curtain wall hanging, and 2 pins at the bottom just to make sure it doesn't fall off the building, and that makes an X. And working in Turkey was the sweet spot of their building history. They were going through their industrial revolution, and because they're going through their industrial revolution, they had a confluence of high technology because Turkish developers had gone into Europe because there's a huge Turkish diaspora, become very powerful, and gotten all the high tech, and then come back into Turkey to start building again, where they still had a really strong craftsman class. And so we could do things there that you simply couldn't afford to do anywhere else. Right? They were making jigs that were very, very precise because they had the craftsmen to do it, and the labor was cheap. And each one of these jigs would get destroyed after 2 or 3 pieces of glass, and they had something like 156 of them. So they could afford to do that. There you see then the glass put onto a jig, but then going into a very high-tech kiln that was selectively heating and cooling the glass. It would sort of slump into the idealized shape, and it was making, you see the slump, and it was making saran wrap, right? Super, super, super thin saran wrap. And there you see it in situ on the building. There's Giselle. For me, I guess. And there's pictures of the result, both on the exterior and interior. So we went from that to that. Now, we are already way in. I was going to talk about a bunch of different projects. I'm probably going to just try and advance over the next one, and then only talk about new work. Is that okay? You mind if unless it crashes the computer. Okay. Oh, and you need to just tell me when to stop. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about new work. And effectively, you're going to see 2 things. First, I can't make the same arguments because we're not done. We haven't gone through the process and then been able to make the really clean retroactive argument. And I make it sound as though that's a negative. For us, it's actually really important. Right? We believe in argumentation. It's not something that we simply turn on for the client to get client. It's really what we believe, and we do it because we realize that it is a way to get clients and to do things and to get really crazy things built. So it's not like it's not Alejandro Zopolo's argument that there are 2 different processes, one for the face of the client and one for the office. We literally, just because that's what turns us on, because we like buildings with agendas, we simply have one process. So the first project I'm going to show is something I'm not really supposed to show. It's the Future Center at Mercedes-Benz. And this is a commission that we started on a competition over 2 years ago. We officially won it about 6 months ago. And it is to add to this campus here. So this is Untertürkheim. This is Mercedes-Benz headquarters and their original factory. This is the UN Studio Ben van Berkel Museum. And it sits next to what they call the center. So the museum and the center is the largest dealership of Mercedes-Benz in the world. And so currently on their Mercedes-Benz world, if you will, they have their past and the present. And they gave us the other side of the site to create its future. Now, they had a very interesting observation, which is that, the first part wasn't an observation, it was a fact. They were getting their butts kicked by BMW and by Audi because everyone thinks that they are more innovative than Mercedes. Mercedes has done such a good job of presenting its past and as the creators of the automobile that people think of them as the past. And yet they are indeed the most innovative automotive company in the world, but they weren't having any ability to express it. And so what they wanted was a building to express that. But of course, they can't express that because that would be giving away their most valued trade secrets. And so that was actually at the core of the issue, or core of the problem of the project. But they also understood something that was quite interesting, which is that one method of doing that would be to recognize that the present is actually the mother of the past and the future. But if they are off kind of paving new ideas into the future, or like an icebreaker, breaking through the ice of the future, that's making space for the things they're doing in the present. And so it was literally a branding idea to make a future center to show whatever this is, to make this, the present, recognized as being state-of-the-art. What were the issues and positions that we took? Well, the first one was it had to be timeless. Why? Well, this is a picture from 1927 of the Weissenhof-Siedelung, which is in Stuttgart, and that is a Mercedes from 1927. That's Corb, that's Mercedes. That looks like it could be done today, and that clearly does not. And this was the mistake we did not want them to do. They were in the world of this, and we didn't want them to make a building like this. We wanted them to make a building like this, because if you do a future center, and it is fashionable, and in 10 years from now it is out of fashion, they and we are going to look stupid. And there's no longer going to be representative of the future. So we almost said, look, it's almost got to be classical, strangely enough. The second position we took is that the museum is cloistered and protected. That's appropriate. But the future center has to be dynamic and exposed and actually a little bit dangerous. It has to be revealing that it's constantly being changed. Right? This is something in which on a daily basis they are going to have to change the contents, or else it will not be the future center. And so reveal that change. Now that is a huge problem in Germany, which has the highest energy codes in the world to do a glass building. We'll come back to that. And the third issue / position was, unlike a museum, a themed museum, which has a historical lineage, the museum, the only thing it has to do is figure out how to add the next thing. Well, in a future center, everything is up for grabs every day. And so learning from the project I just skipped over, so you won't know what I'm referencing, and learning also a little bit from the Wyly Theater, we said, you know what, instead of doing this, where it's a linear thing where you add one thing, let's give them a palette. And that palette can be curated on at will, but a palette has specificity. It's not just a blank box. And that palette had 3 different environments that we proposed. The first was a big horizontal environment that had panoramic views out over the entire campus. It is daylit or ceiling lit, so it has a soft glowing ceiling that's ideal for exhibiting automobiles and parts and things like that. It is floor loaded. It is has the air handling from the floor, so it's just a completely flexible space. And it has a linear circulation, and that linear circulation, while it's linear because it's round, doesn't prioritize anything. And so on this, we said, put the quote, near future. The things about 10 years out that you can present. And the reason you can present them is you've all stolen them from each other already. Right? You all have exchanging the same designers and engineers and technicians, and so you all pretty much know what the catalytic converter of 2024 is going to be. So go ahead and put it on display. But the second thing we provide is the counterpoint to that. It's a much lower environment, just so happens to be blacked out and cruciform shaped. And into this environment, we said put the far future. But you can't show your far future, so you can show 2 things. You can show your visions from the past of the future, i.e. what did Mercedes-Benz think the future was going to look like when they were in 1950, because that's not giving away anything. And they can give visions of represent current visions of the future. And so we basically designed this almost like a theater, where they would use mise-en-scène art cultural productions to be able to create environments that would be provocations. And then the third thing was what I think actually won us the competition. So that environment was this cruciform with a major and minor axis, and its circulation was not scripted. It was actually a 5-square grid where the curator could actually script any relationship of any part to any other part at will. But the part that I think actually won us the competition was the thing they were missing. And we added it to the brief. At first they were very uncomfortable with it, and yet it stayed and stayed and stayed and stayed through this lengthy competition process. And that was, you know what? You need to actually have this building be a debate chamber. It has to be actually literally creating the future on the spot. You need to be able to have the World Economic Forum here. You need to be able to have public debates about overpopulation, about water control, about horizontal expansion of cities. You need to make strategic alliances with MIT and with the ZKM and Karlsruhe. You need to be able to engage the reality that you have to create content on a daily basis, and if you can't, maybe you are not the company that is at the most forefront of the future. So what we provided in the center of the building was a simple device, and it changes the relationship of all the other things while also being this debate chamber. It has 3 elements. Oh, yeah, there you see it. Sort of a contemplative environment. It has a roof that you can suspend anything from, both in terms of technology, heavy objects. It has 2 media screens. The media screens can lift up partially in order to curate different relationships of the 2 floors with each other. It can disappear. It can take any combination thereof. And then it has a theater floor that can be flat. It can take kind of mound, or it can recess. It can go into a debate chamber. And that thing, therefore, is this catalyst that sits in the middle, and they are programming it on a daily basis, and it's constantly moving and taking different configurations. The building literally changes while you're in it. I'll now just take you through a movement through the building. Lobby, there's this element I'll show you in a second, up to the near future, down to the far future, and back out. It's super, super, super dumb. Why is it dumb? Because the shit's changing constantly. So there you see the building from Mercedes-Strasse, where you see the contrast of the cloistered museum to the transparent future center. You enter the main campus, enter the lobby. The lobby, the first thing that you see is actually something called the future garage. There's a huge paternoster of prototypes. So there's this kind of constantly moving element that introduces you where you can enter the exhibitions, that takes you up to the level 2. This is the near future. And then you start to see the impact of these changing media screens and how they can start to curate different relationships of the near future to the far future to this provocation that's at the middle. There you see the far future, also the media screens changing. And last but not least, this is the future core, the element itself. And then also at the same time, let's just go over this because it's kind of almost immaterial, that the lobby then also has the ability to go from being a formal lobby to actually an enormous event space, so they can use it to have all of their unveiling of their new cars. So strangely enough, they will no longer do it in the center of the museum. They will unveil their new cars precisely in the environment where they're debating the future in order to tie the notion of the brand being futuristic along with the current products that are currently now being perceived as being state-of-the-art. Just to emphasize that further, the auditorium is also this highly flexible space. And so that in the end, we're kind of doing this, right? It's kind of what I said about the Wyly Theater. We're giving them a palette. We don't know how they're going to use it. They don't know how they're going to use it. They can't know how they're going to use it. This is totally washed out, so you can't see it. But go back to this idea of the transparent building. This is something we spent an enormous amount of time with Mark on. It is a classic double skin. I'll just show the image of it first. The notion of a double skin is that you have a sacrificial layer on the outside. You have an insulated layer on the inside. You have a retractable curtain that sits in the interlayer. During the summer, you deploy the curtain so the sun hits it, the cavity heats up, and then you can ventilate the cavity so heat doesn't get into the building. And then during the winter, the cavity heats up, and you take that heat and you put it back into the building. And then when you don't have the direct sun on any portion of the building, the curtain simply lifts. So it's like the sun's stupid. It doesn't know that you're walking around kind of holding your hand in front of its face. So you make a transparent building, and the only time you need to deploy the entire thing, so there you see, here, is when there's overcast condition. When there's overcast condition, there's glare, and so then the entire thing will deploy. But on a sunny day, this curtain will simply deploy and retract, going around the building. So just as I said before, the building is changing not only constantly in terms of that inner core, but also in the exterior of the building. You see it at night. Okay, now I'm going to hit like 3 projects really fast. And what's been interesting about our work lately, and I don't know where it's coming from, I almost should ask Mark if he has a theory about where it's coming from. We're talking about buildings doing things, and we're starting to do a lot of things that I never thought we would do, which is moving things. Right? I used to always be really skeptical. When we did the Wyly Theater, we did it, but I always thought that will kind of be the only time we ever do that. And all of a sudden now, we're getting into projects in which moving is becoming important. And I don't know really what that means. So, but I will say that you'll start to see a theme to everything I'm about to describe. Well, maybe one of the projects, that's not true. This is a project in a city I'm not allowed to say, but you can figure out if you look at the image long enough. It has 2 interesting issues. One is it's on the equator, and the second is that it's in a Muslim country. And that drove the design. Why would it being in a Muslim country when it's an 80-story financial tower make any difference to the design? Well, first I'll give you a little background. Something that SOM did learning from Nice, after they split off from Nice, was in a super tall tower, you put the mechanical spaces actually in discrete locations going up the building. And you do that because that allows you to service any floor, well, to kind of move up, down, and above, down and up from each one of these cores. And because you're doing it in intermittent points, that allows the core to stay very small. Right? Because towers, the big issue is money. You want as much meat on the bone, which means you want as small bone as possible because the rest is scripted in terms of how much you can lay out from the distance from the core to the exterior window wall. Well, so why would a Muslim country have a similar issue? Let's think about it. How do you get the occupants of an 80-story tower out of the building 5 times a day to pray? That's a lot of people. And if you actually put the numbers of elevators you needed to do that, it would make a massive core, and that would spread all the remaining meat on the bone very, very inefficiently, and the building would be incredibly expensive. And if you look at the Petronas Towers, which I'm not allowed to say because it happens to be in the same city, you will see that it has exactly that. It is a highly, highly inefficient building, a massive core, and a little ring of offices around this massive core. Well, the concept of the building then was to take the same idea, the mechanical areas are here, put prayer floors opposite those elements. So now everybody moves up or down from their office to a prayer floor in the building during their call for prayer. And in doing that, we keep the core also very, very slender. But we also create an interesting condition I'll come back to in a second. Now, the second issue is that it's on the equator. When you're on the equator, that means the sun comes from where? Everywhere. Now, I'll tell you the funny thing. When we first posted this on our website, we get all these comments from people saying, "You stupid idiots. Don't you know the sun comes from the south?" Oh, man, it's, we're really northernists, if you could say that. So it comes from both sides. So you can actually create a energy screen concept that is uniform, right? As opposed to what we have to do in the northern hemisphere around here, where every face should theoretically be different. On the equator, they can all be exactly the same. And so we created a veil, which was a horrible metaphor for reasons you might be able to guess. And that veil was silver on the outside and black on the inside. It was silver to reflect heat and black so that you could see through it. That's something that 3M basically proved in the 90s, and then Microshade has run with it. This idea that your eye, even as something that's about 96% opaque, your eye, well, your brain will see the 4% and fill in the dots and basically think it's transparent. So you can create something that is highly opaque, as long as it's black on the inside and as long as the apertures are the right dimension in relation to each other, and your brain will basically fill in the dots. And so if you combine that idea of a veil with a building that is a pure profit machine but has larger prayer floors, we can actually do this with it. Right? We can take the prayer floors and we can extend cables that go from the prayer floor down to the mechanical floors, and that now gives us an armature on which we can take elements, and these elements, they are supple elements, but they are still discrete scales, and they have Teflon battens. The reason they have Teflon battens is because if the prayer floor, if the cable is this wide at the bottom, and it goes up like this at the top, the thing has to be able to contract as it goes, which means that the building itself has these beautiful fluted shapes, right? And then they kind of climb up and create almost like a fish scales when the thing retracts. And these you can't see, so I won't talk about Mark's beautiful drawings. There you see the building, the sort of it's hiding its naked body on the inside. As I said, it's a horrible metaphor. The whole reason we thought to do this, actually, it becomes evident in this image. Because it's a financial institution, they're trading 24 hours a day. Right? Otherwise, you would never do this. But if you do it, the problem is at night when you're trading, if you create an exterior blind, that blind will become opaque. And you can't have people trading at 4 o'clock in the morning in which all they see is their own reflection out the window. And so the thing has to go from this during the day, and then at night it has to be able to disappear so they can trade on a 24-hour basis. And they can reach this kind of ideal of having an all-glass building that's still sustainable in an incredibly inhospitable climate. So here's the result. Is that. Okay. 2 more projects, and I'll promise you they're both interesting, but I'll go through them fast. So this is actually a house for a billionaire. And the issues were actually still quite interesting, even though the budget is very generous. This is a gentleman whose ambition is to build a single structure. He comes from a country in which compounds are really not something that is pleasant. And so he wants a single structure that will house him and his 4 children, and this is the catch, and his 4 children's future family. Now the weird thing is that his 4 children are the ages of 18 to 13. So we're building 4,000 square foot residences for kids who have no idea probably even what their sexual orientation may be, let alone what their lifestyle is going to be, or how many kids they're going to have, or how they're going to want to live, and certainly whether or not they want to live with daddy. So that was just the first issue. And then he had several others, which he said he wanted a building that looked like it was always there. He wanted a building that had what he called a grand double American stair, which I think is actually an Italianate stair. Never really was sure of that. And those became the kind of key issues in the design of the building, particularly the first one. How do you deal with designing a structure for people who are theoretically supposed to live here for the rest of their lives and have no idea who they are yet? He also gave us no program, except it had to be 36,000 square feet. So we created our own program. Those were basically the kids' houses, the private areas and the public areas. That was his residence and his public areas, right? He has all the amenities. And we divided it, so we put kids' house, amenity, kids' house, amenity, kids' house, amenity, kids' house, amenity, his house, amenity, right? So kind of like ADA. And then we looped it. And we created what we called the necklace residence. It happens to be on the piece of property in Long Island that F. Scott Fitzgerald claimed that the Great Gatsby lived on. So it gives you some idea of how extraordinary it is. It has amazing views out the Long Island Sound this way, and right down this line, which I think will be the next one, yes, it looks into the oldest, not boreal, but basically the oldest standing forest in all of Long Island. And we organized the house such that his has the views out, the pool and the events also had the views out in the sun. 2 of the kids' houses would be half in the woods and half in the beach, and 2 of the kids' houses would be like tree houses extending out into the woods. And the reason for that is the size of the site. There is currently a Victorian house that's 3 stories here. Its grandfather's. We are not allowed to build more than 2 stories, and the building is so large, and you're only allowed to build 2 stories from quote grade, and only 25 feet. And so the only option we had was to build the house horizontally out into the woods. So there you see the kind of X-ray of the building, and here's the actual underlying strategy, which is that's his house, and since we don't know what the kids are going to be like in the future, let's, again, this idea of a palette. Let's give them 4 distinct kinds of living, and either they do live with daddy for the rest of their lives, and hopefully they'll gravitate towards one house or another, or they're not going to live with daddy for the rest of their lives, at which point, which, by the way, he says, my money, they're going to do what I want, we'll see, is that they can almost do like a timeshare. You know, at Christmas, the one family lives here, at summer break, another they can live here, and so they can kind of share the different living experiences. And so there you see the result. There you see it sitting on the bluff. I don't remember what her name is, but the whole
Daisy.
Daisy is supposedly over here. And there you see it. And we've kind of become obsessed with reflective glass. The building is wrapped in reflective glass. Why? Because he said he wanted it to look like it was always there. It's like the Spanish style thing. We don't really do that kind of thing. So we said, let's make it look like it has never been there. So we've wrapped it in mirror glass so it's invisible, but on the interior courtyard, it's transparent so the family always sees each other. And literally, to our surprise, they have now said that they want the dining rooms. They don't want any of the houses to be able to be closed off. And they want the dining rooms all in this central area. So even if they're not literally eating together, they can all sit as an entire family with all individual families and see each other during dinner. And there's the grand stair. And the grand stair simply takes you up to the rooftop. It's kind of like the dangly bits in the Wyly Theater. And this is the current status of the project. Was a beautiful drawing. But you can at least see like how the typologies have developed over time. And that's the actual drawing. Okay, last project. This one is funny again, and I'll try to explain it really quickly. You guys know the whole ant bully thing that's going on. This is the Nasher Sculpture Garden in Dallas. The Nasher Sculpture Garden was the gift of Ray Nasher, a very important man in Dallas. He created this sculpture pavilion and park. Renzo Piano designed it. It's, according to Ray Nasher before he died on his deathbed, he said the single most important piece of sculpture in the building is actually this egg crate shaped roof structure, milled aluminum structure that allows only pure northern light to come in. So basically it's the cone that is the result of the sun path. It was designed between Renzo Piano and Arup. It lets into the space incredibly beautiful light. The only problem is that directly due north of the National Sculpture Garden was a piece of property on which this was developed. And so it no longer only sees beautiful northern non-direct light. It sees light that is getting magnified directly into the oculi. And because the architects of that building chose to make it a lozenge shape, it does it at every moment of the day of the year. Now the story, the reason I say it's the ant bully, that's how, the ant bully is a kid that magnifies ants and kills them. I didn't actually see the Walt Disney movie, but that's how Renzo Piano has been playing it out in the press. Goliath is hurting David. It's not really true. Well, by the way, that's what it looks like. So it currently does look like Goliath is hurting David. The reason I say it's not really true is that when we started the Wyly Theater in 2004, we were given this. And this is from 1984. And this is the Sasaki master plan for the Arts District. And I'm sure that Renzo Piano got it in 1998, 14 years later, in which that is the site of the sculpture garden. And these are as-of-right towers that are not 40 stories that they got built, but actually 60 stories. Which means Ray Nasher and Renzo Piano knew damn well there was going to be an as-of-right tower built exactly due north of their building. So why the hell did they build a building that has oculi that look directly north and then claim that that's the most important part of the building? So I would actually say it is the ant bully, but it's probably the other way around, because the people who are financing that tower, it's actually the Dallas Police and Fire Pension Fund. Right? So these are the people who have given their lives literally, if not metaphorically, for the city of Dallas, who no longer have a pension because this development is sitting fallow, because no one wants to be in it, because it's shining light into their oculi. Now, huge fight, as you can imagine. The city of Dallas is getting tired of it. It's getting a lot of bad press. It's been in the New York Times. It's been in the Wall Street Journal. And so one of the people that we had worked with on the Wyly Theater, which is right there, came and said, we need you to scare the parties into playing nicely. So, can you conceive of a third option? So the first option is cover this, and Mark and I did our own kind of back of the napkin analysis and kind of confirmed, yeah, they can't really afford to cover it. A, it's not really clear that they could put a bristle on it structurally, and B, if they did, they would lose so much value, right? All these people have pre-sales in which they have these grand views out over Dallas, and now you're going to cover it. And so the amount that it would drop, even if you said the units lost 20% of their value, that would be like $140 million loss on the building, which means the building would no longer be economically viable. So yeah, we actually looked and said, you can't probably really do anything to this. And meanwhile, the sculpture garden has been saying, this is a Dallas treasure and you're not allowed to touch it. And so they actually got to the point of mediation with a mediator who used to be the assistant governor of the state of Texas, to get these two parties to talk. And they weren't talking. And at some point they got so fed up, they asked us to come in and say, can you think of a third option? Because the first two options, which are the two that make sense, don't seem to be having any traction. So can you scare them? And the only option, since this is almost 600 feet tall, is to figure out what is the object that would sit, and it's about 400 feet tall, because they sit right next to each other, that would block the reflection of this into this. And of course, it has to be a material that is also not reflective, because if it was reflected, it would just simply repeat the problem. Now, this is analysis that Front did. What's interesting is because the building is fan-shaped, what you're seeing is that as the light hits each one and moves away, actually the panels, the reflections are not uniform. They're actually panels. So here you're actually seeing each of the panels vertically, or lines vertically, with the space between them as they move out in space. And this is at 3 o'clock on every day of the year. And you can see that it starts to circumscribe a certain shape. And then we also looked at it on the summer solstice, and lo and behold, it made almost exactly the same shape. So now the issue is, how do you get that shape up in the air? And the answer is, do the London Eye. Okay, because the city owns the piece of property right here, it's a parking lot. And so they can actually create a massive bicycle wheel structure with tensile cables, so it's lightweight. Onto those cables, we will put enormous sunshades that retract and deploy and retract. And it will hang off over the piece of air rights that the city owns. And this was the moment that we thought everyone would get scared, right? How could you not? And we totally stole an idea from the Alhambra Mosque, which if you don't know these, you should. They're these beautiful, massive deploying umbrellas that cover the prayer area during the afternoon. And all we had to do is figure out how to reverse engineer it in the opposite way. Right? This is effectively a parasol. It happens to be opening the other way. We needed to design it like this because we had to make sure that it opened like that, but we wanted the machinery or the struts on the other side. So it just was a more difficult engineering process, and we had to make sure we understood it in suction and compression. And that was the result. And of course, the reason we had to make sure that they deployed and retracted is that if you just made a huge sheet, then you would still effectively be making the same problem, and all the units that had their views blocked would become worthless. And so it had to literally deploy and retract. And so we presented it, and it was like crickets. No one said anything. I presented it, and I left. Again, was told to go away. And after an hour, I was back in the room, and they said, "Great, let's build it." That's the last thing I'm going to say. We are still a year in, and the city of Dallas is trying to raise $40 million to do it. I don't know if it's a good idea or not. I can just say that is the result. Okay, so in conclusion, because it's now been forever, the point I was trying to make, both for the built projects and the unbuilt projects, is this idea of, if you understand the constraints, and if you are willing to investigate your agenda with critical naivete, i.e. suspend any solution. I said to the group earlier today, don't want anything. Don't have a solution in mind. Simply study it till you find the thing that actually fits to the constraints without it getting bastardized. The result is almost always, in our experience, inevitably something that is so unusual, also so performative, that it somehow manages to stay capital A architecture. Thank you. I told Alan I was going to talk for an hour and 15 minutes. It's been almost an hour and 45. So you guys can just chat, no problem. But if you also have questions, I'll entertain questions.
Why don't we put the lights up and allow questions, and at a certain point, I'm going to take it away with you. Questions?
You talked a lot about the great successes and the things you've learned through the process, and from those successes that you've taken on projects down the road. It's often said more is possibly learned from failures. Would you have an example of a failure that's been very instructive to you in your practice?
Well, many, but that's why I said the process looks like this. I wouldn't say there's a project that's a failure. I'd say that every project has constant failures. Right? It's not like, that's the disservice of the way I present, is it looks easy and linear. Of course it's not. It's a nightmare. And we're constantly trying to go here and get pushed back to here, and then we go here and we get pushed back to here. And at some point, we find, after like hitting our head against the wall 1,000 times, boom, we suddenly get through. But because that's what we like to do, it happens to also, once you find that route, you can make the perfect story out of it. And so instead of saying it's I said it's retroactive, it happens to be retroactive, meaning it's not like we went to A to B to C to D. But in fact, our process is to make arguments. And we're not done until we can make an argument, because we don't feel that unless we can make an argument, unless we can name it, unless we can describe it, we don't own it, and it's not solved. So instead of saying retroactive, I would say the moment we can make the argument, we know we're basically done. We know we've edited enough. Enough things are out of it. But it's constant failure. I don't know if that's a happy answer. Anybody else?
I got more of a technical question. Since you have created like this type of responsive architecture in some way, it implies that just react to the environment. But that in itself is a project. It's a huge task. And I was wondering what other disciplines like come in to help with that.
There are our structural engineers. We have happily 2 very, very long-standing relationships. As Mark said, we've done 25 projects with him. We've done 23 with Magnus and Clemensic Associates, which Mark, I think, has done himself, not just on our work, but many, many, many more projects with them. And so we have a process that is actually quite shorthand by this point, where we are thinking about the performance of the building, usually in terms of its typology. So like right now we're working on a theater, and we're thinking about how the theater should work. And how it should work in terms of its guts implies certain things about its shape and about its expressiveness, etc. And so literally from the initial conceptualization of the project, we're talking to Mark and we're talking to Jay Taylor from MKA. And they're pushing back, not as in, oh, you can't do that, but pushing back. Some of it's like, these are the realities, but these are also the opportunities. And which means those things are woven in from the absolute beginning of the project. Which I will say also means that when you start hitting walls, some of them times they're economic, you actually have a really strong, the thing is so tight that, and I'm not arguing this to raise more money, but it allows you to force the client to edit and accept what is the absolute core of the project and to save it, because it's also integrated. And so they will allow things to be jettisoned that were superfluous, whereas if the things were not so integrated, they might not be forced into such a clear polarity to make decisions. So weirdly, I shouldn't say weirdly, but that process, the integration of the facades, Mark also, his team also are exceptional engineers, so sometimes their work goes beyond just the facades. But also we have this engineering firm and we all work that way, and it gives us something that allows us to edit and save the things that are most important about it. Are there any other questions?
You set up an argument about constraints and rules in the design process, but then clearly you're breaking lots of rules in a really interesting way, right? And hats off to that. So I'm curious, how do you know when to break your own rules?
It's funny. Let me give you a little bit of tangential anecdote, which is whenever a more experienced person comes into the office, there's usually some tension. Because first, they get frustrated. They're like, why are you letting the office try to reinvent the wheel? Like, you know the exiting is going to have to be this way. And I'm like, yeah, I do. And they're going to continue to try to do it otherwise. And you know what? They're probably 9 out of 10 times not going to be able to figure out how to do the exiting differently. But two things are happening. One is that, lo and behold, 1 out of 10 times, some kid 2 years out of school figures something out that completely turns everything you think you know on its head. And so we just simply make the environment for that shit to happen. But the second is simply because that's the environment. Everything, even the things that aren't as sanctified, are also getting put on their head. And so really interesting things come out. The reason I tell you that story is we recently had a very, very talented woman who was very experienced join the office, and she actually got angry with me during one of our design sessions. And design sessions are very Socratic. We put things out, and the team tears them apart. Right? And the whole purpose of tearing it apart is just to see what survives. And at some point she got pissed, and she said, you know what? I said that 20 minutes ago, and now you're saying, you said you couldn't do it, now you're saying it, and you know, basically, what the fuck? And I said, we are allowed to have competing and divergent and incoherent streams of investigation. Right? I negated it because there was a chance to find out if it was the strongest or the weakest. And one way of doing it is to negate it. That's the Socratic process. So how do we know when to break rules? We're just breaking them all the time. And most of the time we fall flat on our face. Most of the time. 99% of the time. But imagine a project which, if you're successful reinventing, say, 3 things in a building, I mean, that's huge. Most buildings don't have one thing. You invent 3 things, it's gold. And so that process, now it is a frustrating process, right? Because people are hitting their heads against the wall all the time. And I have to admit, as I get older, I have to step back more and more and more, because I myself recognize that I am, I don't want to say jaded, but I recognize that in myself, I'm more quickly to leap to the conventional solutions, to go, you know what, come on guys, I know what the answer to that's going to be. You don't have to do it. I've seen it 20 times before. But if I start doing that, it creates an ethos in the office of accept convention. And so I really have to just sit there, and you know, the deadline's looming, and just be going, okay, let them do what they do. And I write it down, and I have it on my refrigerator door. Like every morning I look at it, it says, like, let them alone. But that process is simply fail, bing. Any other? Does that answer your question?
No, but it was a wonderful failure.
No.
We learned from the speech, and actually that was from the answer we learned, and that actually is your answer.
Yeah.
That you're doing it because the 99% of failure is as important as 1% success.
Yeah.
Because of learning to happen.
I mean, in the group before we talked about, you know, I said, they were using the term research, and I said, this is a total tangent, but I said, you know, you got to stop using the word research, because science is a certain thing, and observations about environments are not research. They're observations, opinions. But there is something important to learn from science that architecture, for some reason, doesn't do very well, which is, in science, if there's a whole field of string theory, and you put your theory out and you do research after stating your thesis and it fails, everybody claps. Why? Because you just saved the rest of the planet wasting years trying to fuck off with that stuff. Now everybody goes over here, right? It's just as valuable to fail in science definitively as it is to succeed. Except it's the one thing you won't get the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean the Nobel Prize for, unfortunately, which I think is actually crazy. I think there are people, scientists, who have failed so dramatically, and I don't mean that as in they failed in a typical thing, they have so definitively said, you know what, that doesn't work, that they should actually receive the Nobel Prize for it, because they clobbered 7/8 of all the stuff that was out there just by their one quote failure. And that's something that we as architects should learn from.
So you said at the beginning that you can't talk about, or that you don't talk about art publicly.
Beauty.
Or beauty, excuse me, beauty publicly. But can you talk about, so when you do your works, can you talk about morals publicly? Like you're talking about, you know, like what architecture can do. What if one of your projects you wanted it to do something for someone other than the client, like with the public, for instance? Could you talk about that?
Absolutely.
Like,
Absolutely, because that I think is a, so first let me say why we don't talk about beauty. We don't talk about beauty because I said I think it's a fool's game. Because I'll say I like it and you say you don't, and that's the end of the conversation. What are we going to do? And we have a fight about whether or not you like what you like? And as someone who's trying to get a client to do something, if that's all the debate I can have with them, the only people who succeed at that are the 5 or 10 really, really, really famous architects who have such definitive aesthetic styles that they can get away with that. But they're handcuffed because, I mean, I'm not sure if you know, but Frank Gehry sometimes gets fired from jobs because he tries to do something else. And they say to Frank Gehry, that's not a Frank Gehry, right? So he's just as trapped in his own process as he will trap the client. So we don't, that's why we don't talk about beauty. But can you talk about morals? Of course, all the time. You can say to a client, by example, we don't tell our clients, but we start out with what we think is a highly, highly, highly sustainable building in every project. And it's just baked into the cost. And we let them discover it. We don't tell them, because we think that sustainability should be the same thing as gravity. Right? It should stand up, and it should not kill the next generation. I shouldn't have to ask the client if that's okay. Right? And when they do discover, where the hell is this $1.2 million coming from for this high-end chillers? And they're like, oh yeah, because this building is going to be sustainable. And they're like, wait, and they're like, yeah, that's your responsibility. You see that all the time. I don't know what more I would say. Any other questions?
Are there any materials, like specific materials that kind of inspire you from a poetic sense?
Mirror glass. If I wasn't going to say it, he was going to say it. Yeah, I mean, I would say that I personally have a weird fetish with transparency and reflectivity. Like, I just think, you know, it's just something that turns me on. I mean, aesthetically, I just like it. I don't want to say it, except you can come with me and try and meet my therapist and we can talk about it. I don't know. But yeah, that's it. Can you think of anything else? I don't know.
In the Caltech project,
Yeah.
if, okay, let's say for instance the president had stepped down, but they still wanted you to redesign, even after you've done all that, would you, just because I think I've had conversations with people before where they say that's why a number of architects aren't good businessmen, they don't know when they're not do stuff for free. You know, I don't know if I'm making sense.
Yeah, absolutely. But let me be clear. One of the other lectures I give a lot is about how design, the single most important design element is your contract. And if you don't know your contract, you don't know how contracts work, you're worthless. You can't do anything. So all I'm pointing out is that there's just a reality that there's a weak moment in the contractual apparatus of design, which is they haven't yet totally approved it, and now there has to be a change. And that's before something's locked in. And who really is responsible for that? And even if you can get the client contractually to accept that they're responsible in a contract, your relationship isn't very strong. So it's not really the moment you want to start sending them extra bills. That's all I'm getting at. But that is not the same thing as to say, we will, unless it is a clear decision on our part. I mean, Mercedes, we kept going and going and going for a year and a half because for certain reasons we felt that was an incredibly important project to win, and we thought we could win it. So we sucked it up, but it was not out of carelessness. I think that if you do whatever your profession is, I think if you're the best in the world, you should get paid like you're the best in the world. And so this whole idea of the suffering artist, first of all, artists, they don't suffer, they make shitloads of money. So I don't know why we as artists shouldn't also make tons of money. Calatrava, Frank Gehry, Zaha, they all make tons of money. They live very well. There's no reason we all shouldn't.
On that note, I really do have to get you in a
Right.
taxi to the airport. So please join me in thanking John.